Hello, we welcome you to another episode of the Cosmic Magics podcast, as usual, with your hosts, myself, Bernhard Gunther, and my wife, Laura Matsu. And today we'll be discussing and talking about why awakening often begins with the breakdown and disillusionment and entails a lot of suffering sometimes. The most common questions really people ask when they look at the state of the world today are, why won't there be a collective awakening anytime soon? I've heard these questions before. Why do people conform so easily, right? Why do most people never wake up from the collective hive mind? And why are those who question authority, religion, or social norms often ridiculed or persecuted, right? As we have seen definitely over the past 5 years as well, with the pandemic and all of that. When we look at the world, many of us are kind of impatient, so to speak, right? We want the quote-unquote normies to wake up. We want to move on in our collective evolution, but it seems to be a very hard process on a collective and on a personal level. Now, when we look into ancient esoteric traditions, right, they have offered insights into these questions for sure. Even in modern times, Carl Jung's concept of individuation and David Hawkins' map of consciousness can help explain these questions with different levels of consciousness, different levels of soul lessons and levels of development. You can also view it through the lens of soul evolution and the concept of soulless humans or organic portals, which we explored in the previous episode. But there's another very interesting framework that brings these ideas together in a very powerful way. And that is the theory of positive disintegration, which was developed by Kazimierz Dabrowski, a Polish man. And it really offers a clear structure of understanding why some people suffer deeply and question everything and go through really profound inner crisis, while others remain very comfortably adjusted to the consensus of society and don't seem to have any internal struggle. Now, I first came across Dabrowski's work in the mid-2000s. That was around the same time when I was studying Boris Moravie's Gnosis trilogy, which is based on esoteric Christianity. And Dabrowski's framework of the theory of positive disintegration helped me to understand Moravie's concept, which is also an esoteric concept of what he calls moral bankruptcy. That means in psychological terms is the necessary collapse of the false personality that initiates real inner transformation, right? This is the disillusionment. Now, this threshold is what also the esoteric traditions call the descent into the underworld, or in the Christian mythology as well, the dark night of the soul. That is where true spiritual development begins. It's sometimes painful, terrifying, and intense is the descent, right? It also ties into the law of ascent and descent. We've talked about this before. But not everyone has what Dabrowski calls developmental potential, or DP. This is the inner capacity to evolve. And one of these key components of developmental potential is something he termed overexcitability. And that is a heightened sensitivity that amplifies perception, emotions, thought, and imagination, right, with very intense highs and intense lows. And for those who kind of calibrate high or have a high overexcitability, inner turmoil is often the fire that catalyzes awakening. It's kind of the spark that initiates it. Now, reflecting back on my childhood when I grew up, I was definitely very confused by my own emotional intensity and existential questions, right? Nobody taught how to deal with my intense emotions in school. And as a child, even as a 10-year-old, I would look up in the stars and question there must be more to this life. Now, in my 20s, I was really pushed to the edge of suicide several times because this descent into the darkness within me and the emotional intensity was unbearable at times. And I had no context, I had no understanding how to deal with it. So that suffering really forced me, in a sense, to dive deeper into the inner work and really study psycho-spiritual work, literature. Just to stay alive, I had to figure myself out. At the same time, I experienced also moments of incredible creativity and revelation, so there were intense descents into emotional suffering of despair, shame, guilt, but also ascents into higher states of consciousness or love and really insights that propelled me and motivated me to move on. But ultimately, it really felt like I was a battleground for unseen forces working through me. And another thing really emerged, and maybe many of you can relate to that as well. As I was going through this process, I couldn't understand why many of my friends didn't wrestle with the same questions or even care to. Most seem very satisfied with a very conventional life, right? Even early on, choose a career, have a family, buy a house, make money, go on vacations, entertain yourself, go to parties, and so forth, right? But back then, I really didn't care for any of that. Yet at the same time, I also envied them. Paradoxically, I envied their ability to be really content with it all, while I was suffering internally with an intense inner emotional life and questions that wouldn't leave me alone. So for a long time, during those times, I also thought that something was wrong with me, right? And if I had gone to a psychiatrist back then, I'm sure I would have been diagnosed with depression, bipolar, or worse, who knows, right? Put me onto all kinds of pharmaceuticals and so forth. But thankfully, I didn't. Instead, during this time, as the divine grace kind of came down, so to speak, and guided me, I found a book that changed my life. And I've told this briefly before in other podcasts, but the book was called Freedom from the Known by Krishnamurti. And in it contained the quote, "It is no measure of health to be well adjusted to a profoundly sick society." And then it dawned to me, I really realized that nothing was wrong with me, that my complex inner life was actually a gift and part of a deeper process described in all esoteric traditions I would later come to study. So I learned that most people try to adjust to this profoundly sick society, whether through conventional pill-based psychiatry or trying to fix their false self, right, polishing the personality mask to make it fit into a pathological world. Now, when I came across Dabrowski's work, he really affirmed this insight. You know, what modern psychology calls maladjustment, neurosis, or depression, or even psychosis, he saw as an evidence of higher potential. These are signs that the individual is outgrowing the false self and beginning a difficult but necessary transformation. So rather than pathologizing this inner conflict and not being able to fit into conventional society, Dabrowski saw it as a sign of personality development, a movement from what he calls mechanical conformity. In his work is there this level 1, towards an authentic selfhood, level 5. And this development unfolds through these 5 levels and is fueled by the intensity of one's inner life. So now in this podcast, we will explore Dabrowski's work in depth. In part 1, we lay out the foundation, walk through the 5 levels, unpack key concepts, and explain what he means by developmental potential. Then we'll also analyze level 1 in more depth, where most humans reside. And in part 2, there's always part 2 to our podcast, which you can sign up for the membership at my website, veilofreality.com for members. In part 2, we'll go deeper into levels 2 through 5 and how to recognize where you are, what is needed to move forward, and also the traps that can lead to stagnation or regression to a low level. We also tie all of this into esoteric teachings and psycho-spiritual work because he confirms a lot of ancient traditions or even modern psycho-spiritual work, even Carl Jung's work and so forth, and put it into the larger context of the evolution of consciousness. So if you've ever really felt you don't belong, that you don't, or that you see and feel too much, right, that you're riding waves of very inner intensity and no one around you understands you or can relate to you, or if you have asked the questions I opened up with, then this episode is definitely for you. Now, just for context, to lay out the framework, Dabrowski conceived this core concept of the theory of positive disintegration actually already in the 1930s, but then evolved it and it was articulated more fully between the 50s and 70s in the 2 big publications which he published, which we based this podcast on. That was 1964, called The Positive Disintegration, one of his most influential books, followed by 1970 when he released Psychoneurosis is Not an Illness.
Yeah, so I just want to give some context here because I came across this idea about a month ago and I really related to it myself. And then I started talking to you about it, and it turns out that you had written an article about it years ago. So we both came across it in our own way. But then we basically decided to do the podcast because I came across it. There was a renewed interest in it. And then we kind of dug out your article and then went from there. So let's just go over first the 5 main aspects of the theory of positive disintegration. So number 1, inner turmoil is a sign of growth. So emotional intensity, anxiety, inner conflict, which is often labeled as psychoneurotic symptoms, can be factors of a person's potential for higher development. And here's a quote from his book. Almost as a rule, these factors are related to increased mental excitability, depressions, dissatisfaction with oneself, feelings of inferiority and guilt, states of anxiety, inhibitions, and ambivalences. All symptoms which a psychiatrist tends to label psychoneurotic, end quote. And number 2, disintegration is necessary. So true personality growth requires going through internal and external conflicts, maladjustment to lower level social norms, and the breakdown of the old self. This disintegration is a prerequisite for reintegrating at a higher level. So maladjustment to lower level social norms, so not feeling like you adjust to the regular society, the breakdowns, the internal and external conflicts. This is necessary for reaching higher levels, basically. And to quote Dabrowski, accelerated psychic development is actually impossible without transition through processes of nervousness and psychoneurosis, without external and internal conflicts, without maladjustment to actual conditions in order to achieve adjustment to a higher level of value, to what ought to be, and without conflicts with lower level realities, end quote. 3, development is self-directed. Individuals become active agents in their own transformation. By reflecting critically on themselves and their values, they engage in an inner process of conscious self-education and psychic refinement. And to quote Dabrowski again, psychoneuroses, especially those of a higher level, provide an opportunity to take one's life in one's own hands. They are expressive of a drive for psychic autonomy, a special moral autonomy, through transformation of a more or less primitively integrated structure. This is a process in which the individual himself becomes an active agent in his disintegration and even breakdown. Thus, the person finds a cure for himself, not in the sense of a rehabilitation, but rather in the sense of reaching a higher level than the one at which he was prior to disintegration. This occurs through a process of an education of oneself and an inner psychic transformation, end quote.
Just to pipe in here, this is a very core aspect of his work too, that the development is self-directed, meaning the person then becomes his or her own therapist, so to speak, right? And really understands more what the psyche is trying to tell him.
Okay. And then 4, this process involves moving from an externally imposed identity, level 1, towards a more autonomous, consciously chosen self, level 5, relates to also individuation. And 5, mental health is redefined. From Dabrowski's perspective, mental health is not the absence of inner conflict, but the presence of meaningful, developmental, inner struggle that leads to the emergence of a higher, more autonomous personality. And Dabrowski defines personality as, quote, a self-aware, self-chosen, self-affirmed, and self-determined unity of essential individual psychic qualities, end quote. So it is an ideal, it's autonomous, it's your true essence, and it's formed by a conscious value structure that arises from self-reflection, inner work, and a moral drive. And it's not to be mistaken for the false personality, but relates more to the individuated self, as Jung would say. So we're going to just set the stage and very quickly go over the 5 levels of personality development, and then we will go into each level in more depth throughout the podcast. So this is just a brief overview, and then we're going to go into everything in more detail. So level 1, so these are all different levels you can find yourself at. Primary integration. The vast majority of people live here. This is when personality is shaped by biological drives, by social and cultural norms. It relates to the consensus in evolutionary astrology. There's little to no inner conflict because your behavior is guided by instinct, the desire to conform, and to really, you're kind of linked into this hive mind group identity. And, as a person, you might seem really well adjusted to society. You can be very successful in materialistic terms, but you'll lack true individuality or self-reflection. A person at this level will live reactively. They tend to chase pleasure, status, and success without questioning the deeper meaning behind what they do. And this is seen in just your everyday average person, those who lack an inner life and those who tend not to self-reflect. So that's level 1. Level 2, uni-level disintegration. And this is when there's a beginning of an inner conflict. You begin to have existential questions. The person starts to feel that something is off, that these values and social roles that most people just go along with, they lose meaning to them. And conflict exists, but only on a horizontal level. So there's no clear sense of higher versus lower. And choices feel really weighted, even if they contradict each other. And the person might struggle with conflicting desires, roles, with social expectations, but at this level, they still lack a clear internal compass to discern which option is better, which has more, which is more moral, which is more better for their development. So the struggle is between equivalent options, like should I take career A versus career B? Should I conform? Should I be a rebel? Rather than rather than a conflict between lower egoic impulses and a higher ideal self. And this often results in emotional turmoil, confusion, or paralysis. And when that happens, a person can actually just regress to level 1 and collapse, or they can progress. And this stage contains the potential for growth or breakdown. So I see this a lot with people where they start to kind of have this inner conflict. And I've actually seen people kind of go back to their old life. Like they'll start to begin a process of awakening and self-discovery, but then they'll just go back to their old life and pretend that nothing happened. And they'll almost like sometimes even project like, oh, I don't need to heal anymore. I'm already
fine.
done with this. I'm just going to watch like Netflix and just be a normie. Like, no, people actually do this all the time. It's very fascinating. Okay. So let's go to level 3, spontaneous multi-level disintegration. This is when a person now perceives a vertical dimension. Can you just define this vertical and horizontal level? Because this is not, we need to define that before we use these terms, by the way.
So horizontal, again, like he says in level 2, there's conflict exists by the horizontal level, meaning it's just, you look at the horizon, you know what I mean? So it's on an equal level. Like, for example, the choice is being, should I do, it's still externally driven. Should I take job 1, A or B, or maybe I'll be happy with JB, or maybe with this relationship is all on the same level, right? Or even just like you said, should I conform, be a rebel? Yeah. But it's not based on what starts in level 3, the vertical dimension. The vertical dimension is you see within yourself or even the world what is of a higher value based on truth and the higher self, the ideal self versus the lower self, egoic consciousness. You know what I mean? You can see even higher chakras, lower chakras. That's the vertical.
Got it.
So horizontal, like most people navigate the world, then they're just trying to gain happiness and, content, enjoyment, and fulfillment from outside choices that are all on the same level. They're just
it doesn't make a difference for their growth, basically, what they choose.
Exactly. It's not based on inner values. It's just what they can get out of it from the outside.
Yeah. So it's like, this job will make me more money, but it may not actually contribute to my own growth, basically, kind of decisions. Yeah. Okay. So going back to level 3, this is a spontaneous multi-level disintegration. This is when the person perceives a vertical dimension, so they have a clear sense of higher versus lower within themselves and in the world in terms of lower and higher aspects of the self, not the ego view of better or worse.
That's the key point.
This is when the person perceives higher ideals and begins to feel moral discontent with lower impulses. So when you kind of start to know better, and I think this is when conscience starts to develop, right? And it creates this inner struggle because you know what's right to do, and you know what's the more, decision in line with conscience. However, you're not making it like based on like, what will I make more money on? It's like what's actually better and more in line with my values and moral compass.
Oh, also you can see it from young in terms that your shadow comes up and you recognize your own darkness and your own, lower impulses.
Yeah. And this is when the person perceives higher ideals and begins to feel moral discontent with lower impulses. Internal disharmony increases, but so does the possibility of authentic transformation. And this stage catalyzes deep inner work and self-reconstruction. And this is really the archetypal red pill moment where there's no going back. And then level 4, organized multi-level disintegration. This is conscious, deliberate self-development. The individual actively reshapes their values, beliefs, and behaviors based on the emergence of a personally chosen hierarchy of values. Internal fragmentation gives way to inner coherence, grounded in higher ideals. Behavior is no longer reactive, but consciously intentional, and the person becomes self-directed with a deep sense of purpose and responsibility. And then level 5, which is secondary integration. This is when the fully developed autonomous personality comes through. This is when thought, emotion, and action are harmonized around consciously chosen values. The person lives in alignment with their personality ideal and acts as a force for transformation. They embody authenticity. So example are visionaries, inventors, authentic artists, spiritual leaders. And this is when people have a strong sense of purpose and they feel fully aligned with it. And they're often engaged in creative work, transformative work, or humanitarian work. And there is little inner conflict, but often great external resistance from people in level 1 in the consensus. So what did you mean by that, by the way? The great external resistance for people in level 1 in the
because they're being attacked from the consensus.
Got it. Yeah.
That's why all the visionaries, that's why Jesus got nailed to the cross as an example, or anybody else.
Yeah. So like all the people on level 1 kind of like just, they probably don't even understand or comprehend someone at level 5. It's so beyond their scope.
It threatens their existence.
Exactly. Okay.
But you know what's another interesting? You know the famous bell curve?
Yeah.
Right? It fits into, because like he says, Dabrowski, people on level 1 have no internal conflict at all, right? And then if you're on a high level, on level 5, they don't have no internal conflict anymore either. But they're fully aligned on a higher level.
It's coming from a different...
The bell, most people have conflict starting level 2 when the disintegration happens through this intense conflict.
Yeah.
But you use it for the evolution until there's no internal conflict anymore at all. But then you're aligned basically with divine will.
Yeah.
Okay, so we go deeper into each level in this podcast to really understand it. Also, where you are at, and most importantly, what it takes to move through these different levels and how it's possible to regress as well. But really to understand in context of how to move through these 5 different levels and how to use the process of disintegration or disillusionment to evolve, we need to understand the 3 factors, as Dabrowski calls them. So basically those factors determine whether someone stays stuck in a level, evolves, or potentially regresses, right? And Dabrowski determined these 3 factors that are pulling us towards or away from development, right? These 3 factors really explain why people stay asleep or wake up. And they're really the core to understanding how development unfolds across these 5 levels, which Laura just went through. Basically, they present differing motivating influences in human development, right? And depending on which factor dominates, the individual will either remain at a lower level or progress to a higher level of inner growth and self-actualization and self-realization. So the first factor is just heredity, biological impulses. That represents just innate instincts, temperament, drives, and biological predispositions. It includes both lower impulses like aggression, sex impulse, pleasure-seeking, and inherited traits or talents, also from your family. It operates automatically. It's mostly seeking survival, pleasure, dominance, power. Unchecked, if it's unchecked, obviously it can lead to egocentric, antisocial, even psychopathic behavior. It's really the lower nature on the lower first chakras. So when the first factor dominates, people are integrated at the biological level of nature, as Dabrowski calls it. They may be, yes, talented or even successful in social standards, but their development is still very self-serving and unreflective. They can even be very creative and all that, have talents, but it's used for manipulation or purely personal egocentric gains, right? And interestingly, anybody who's dominant in level 1, driven by the biological impulse, the impulse for creating family or having children is driven by unconscious biological impulses to procreate or very egocentric desires, right? And it's more about you to have children rather than about the child itself. Now, the second factor that comes into the equation is the social environment, conformity. That reflects the internalization of social norms, cultures, values, and general education, which we all have to varying degrees, right? And encourages people to act in social acceptable ways and fit in, right? The social environment. It can suppress individuality, critical thinking, and authentic expression. We know that. And this second factor leads to external adaptation and really conventional morality that's kind of adopted from the hive mind. When the second factor is dominant, people conform to social expectations. They live lives that appear normal or well-adjusted, but their values are programmed and conditioned, not consciously chosen, right? Taken on by the media, by virtue signaling, by whatever is the latest trend to get upset about. You can see it all over the world, especially nowadays with social media, right? There can be negative adjustment and adapting to a possible pathological society as well. Now, the third factor, very important, that's autonomy, the inner drive toward growth. That's a conscious, self-directed force of personality development, as he calls it, and allows individuals to resist the mechanical biological impulses and also resist social cultural conditioning. It motivates a person to choose really higher values and questions mainstream consensus assumptions and striving more towards the ideal self, right, the higher self. It is really central to moral autonomy. Now, this third factor is crucial, very important, of moving from unconscious conformity to conscious evolution. And as we share and talk about later on or shortly, this third factor of in an inner drive towards growth actually starts to emerge in level 3 and then dominates in level 4 and 5. It's not even there yet in level 1 and 2, right? It appears when the person starts to ask really questions, who am I, right? And what kind of person should I become? It supports the development of a very unique value hierarchy. And without it, one cannot progress to higher levels at all. So the third factor I would even almost relate to the emergence of the true self, of the psychic being, of the essence coming through, right? That kind of takes over the developmental of the being, which you can also relate to esoteric teachings as well.
Okay, so now we're going to really talk about what factors help someone basically develop the capacity to evolve. So now we know the 5 levels. Now we know the different 3 factors that influence the 5 level. Well, it's time to introduce what actually allows someone to move through these levels. What qualities do they need to have? And a central concept in Dabrowski's work is developmental potential. He calls it, just for short, we'll refer to it as DP, which is the inner capacity that determines whether and how a person can progress through the stages of disintegration and transformation. It is the raw material of inner transformation. So these 3 core components of developmental potential are as follows. 1, what he calls overexcitability. We also will refer to it as OE, which is a heightened neurological sensitivity that amplifies perception, emotion, thought, and imagination. And there's 5 types of that. There's 1, psychomotor, which is heightened energy, movement. 2, sensual, increased sensitivity to sensory experiences. 3, imaginational, which is a vivid inner fantasy and vivid inner imagery. 4, intellectual, intense curiosity and love of learning. 5, emotional, deep emotional sensitivity with big ups and downs. So this physiological intensification acts as a catalyst for inner conflict, depth and reflection, and individuals with high OE often experience intense inner turmoil. You know what's interesting too? the majority of the reason why I got actually, besides my own suffering too, got addicted to drugs is because of this overexcitability. I felt things way too intensely. So when I was in turmoil, I felt it really intensely. But when I was creative, I felt it more intensely. And I realized a lot of this drug addiction was just me trying to manage my overexcitability so I can appear like the normal people and I could get along in the world, because it was very hard to be around people who didn't have this quality, who would think that I was like weird, or, as I've often seen as very strange, even in high school. So that's very fascinating.
Yeah, but imagine now how many children have signs of this overexcitability nowadays, and they put them on pharmaceuticals.
Yeah, or, they're constantly in front of screens too, as well. Okay, 2, special talents and abilities. So this includes traditional measures of giftedness, such as intellectual capacity, artistic talent, or exceptional creative insight. However, talent alone is not sufficient. It has to be directed by inner growth and values, not driven by the ego or desire to conform. And 3, the third factor, this is the autonomous inner drive to evolve morally and psychologically. It enables a person to consciously choose higher values over biological impulses, the first factor, or social conditioning, the second factor. The third factor represents the will to grow, often against the grain of societal norms. And so an important insight is that giftedness and DP are not the same.
Developmental potential.
Yeah. So while gifted individuals often display traits associated with developmental potential, such as intense emotion or imagination, not all gifted people have the inner motivation or emotional depth required for personality development. Conversely, many people with high developmental potential may never be classified as gifted in conventional terms, yet undergo profound personal evolution. And one-sided development he saw as dangerous. A person may have high intelligence or creativity, but lack emotional depth or ethical grounding. And so without this third factor, this desire to evolve, basically these abilities can be misused or used for selfish or destructive purposes.
It is important to understand, because that means not just if you're gifted or talented child doesn't mean that they have developmental potential.
Yeah, like a lot of like actors and actresses who are really successful, but like maybe doing kind of sketchy things in their personal lives, don't have that moral compass.
Yeah, not only that, but they're also just driven by egocentric goals.
Yeah, exactly.
Of the consensus, yeah.
So basically, Dabrowski estimated that 35% of humanity has a potential to develop its personality towards its own ideal image, while the remaining 65% are often stuck in level 1, which means they don't think or act autonomously. They cannot actually engage in introspection, and they'll never break free from the social structures into which one is born. So they tend to focus all their aggression and frustration purely on the outside world and on other people.
We see that a lot.
They tend to be easier controlled and manipulated via propaganda, media, since they're more externally orientated and they have no inner compass to discern truth from lies. And this is where, mass formation psychosis really thrives, because the majority of people are being driven by these external control factors.
Okay, so this is, and maybe a lot right now, but it's important to break it down to understand again these 3 factors, right? We talked about the heredity, biological impulse, the second factor, social environment, conformity, and then the third factor, autonomy, inner drive, right? Which determines which level predominates then. And then the concept of overexcitability, which is the core aspect of Dabrowski's theory, which results in disintegration, in extreme internal conflict, and emotional ups and downs. And he sees then what a lot of people nowadays, or conventional psychology, would call it as neurosis, depression, go on this pill, something is wrong with you, you're mentally ill. He saw actually as a strong sign for potential to evolve to higher levels of development.
Yeah, and I can see that once you're able to work through your own trauma and sensitivity, you'll see that your sensitivity is a gift. Like, for example, sensitivity can make you have a very profound spiritual experience just sitting in nature and observing the elements around you. You can be deeply affected by a piece of music in a way that's transcendent. So, sensitivity may be hard sometimes in a world which seems generally pathological, but on the spiritual path, it becomes an asset. It becomes an asset for you having higher spiritual experience, having deeper relationships with yourself and others. And it's probably one of the most essential aspects to your own awakening process.
Yeah, exactly. So now let's dive deeper into all the different levels. Now we'll cover in this first hour level 1 and then go deeper in the next levels in the second hour. So level 1 again is the primary integration. That's what also Dabrowski calls the adapted machine. And the vast majority of people live at this level, right? Like he estimated back then 65%, right? Interesting, it's very similar to David Hawkins' map of consciousness, 70% below 200, or evolutionary astrology consensus state is already around that number, right? So
yeah, it's 70.
A lot of different correlations here. He also referred to this level very controversially as psychopathic. But keep in context, that was back in the 60s, so he didn't mean this in the clinical criminal sense of the word, but denotes a state of developmental inertia, emotional shallowness, and really absence of any internal moral conflict, right? At this level, there's no authentic inner life, no real reflection, no impulse towards outside transformation.
Which is interesting because I often wonder, because I can like internally struggle over the smallest things. And then I sometimes wonder, are other people struggling in the same way? And basically, according to Dabrowski, the answer is no.
No, and this is really important because what was very, like, as I shared in the introduction, what many of us do who are very sensitive, have conscience, have really moral struggle, or like questioning everything in the world and what we do.
Yeah.
Then we project this on other people and think they feel and think like we do.
Yeah.
And to realize not even my closest friend didn't. They're really content with a very, what we call, shallow approach to life. Not to say this in a judgmental way, but just a very different, what he would call, internal value system.
Which is why, even for example, because obviously we deal with a lot of strangers, especially online, and some people will say like really nasty and rude things. And the reason they're able to do that is because they have no internal struggle about it. Whereas if I were to say something that would maybe perhaps hurt someone online, I would be like overthinking it for the next few days and then wanting to change what I said or whatever,
Exactly.
but these people actually don't struggle in that same way. It's just, they just do it.
Yeah. And we can take this even further, which I was going to address as well. That also explains, especially in social media, all the copying, all the plagiarizing, how people use other people's content for themselves to monetize, and they don't think twice. They justify it. Yeah. Most people justify it, as Dabrowski, the way they justify it, that's, the person's on level 1 is, everybody's doing this, so I'm going to do it too.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, exactly.
All right. So people in level 1, about 65% of humanity, according to him, are really dominated by the first and second factors. Again, the first factor is just driven by biological drives, pleasure seeking, just competition, self-preservation, and again, even creating families, having children is just mechanical, biological impulse to procreate, or we are egocentric reasons to have children. And the second factor, social conformity and the cultural programming, right? These people just follow social scripts. They identify with roles, with parties, with the side, with norms, group consensus, and without questioning them at all. You see them across the whole political spectrum, left and right. There's no third factor in level 1. Again, as a reminder, third factor, there's no autonomous questioning of self-values. There's no capacity for true introspection and self-awareness. Hence, there's no inner conflict. Hence, according to Dabrowski, there's no potentiality to evolve. So these people at level 1, again, are very well adjusted to society, but adjustment is mechanical. There's no friction between their behavior and the inner values because they haven't formed any. They don't have any, like you just mentioned, right? They experience little to no existential questioning because they have no awareness of them really at all. They're not aware of deeper possibilities. They don't question the bigger questions of the meaning of life.
Which is, this is very affirming because I thought when I was like 9 years old and I realized that my grandma was going to die and everyone was going to die and I went through this existential crisis, right? That's actually, in his terms, like a positive thing to go through these inner conflicts very young. because it shows your own developmental potential, essentially.
Exactly. Because on level 1, the person acts purely from biological impulse and really uncritical absorption of social norms, right? Even the reaction are socially scripted, follow trends and mimic, even mimic influences or mimic people. He even goes so far, people just go to, I remember reading in his book, go to, funerals and just cry because everybody else is crying. Or they go to parties and laugh because everybody else is laughing.
But you know what's interesting though, because I also see in my own development, even though I had these deeper existential questions at a very young age, what happened is when I entered high school, I was like, I had this conscious realization that if I don't conform to my peers around me, I would suffer. I would get made fun of. So I made the conscious decision to go through a period of like a couple years of like conformity, just because I didn't want to suffer even more than I already had suffered. So like, what is that like in his model? Like, is that me being at level 1, or is that me,
well, you're doing it consciously.
Yeah.
This is not, people don't do this consciously.
Yeah.
They're putting on the mask going along.
Yeah, they're
right?
just doing
There's no awareness behind it.
Yeah, okay, got it. Yeah, interesting.
And also, people level 1, they have for them, ends justify the means. They have that kind of logic, which I mentioned before. Or everybody's doing it, so I'm going to do it too. So they lie and cheat. They manipulate. Again, explains why so many people rip others off on social media, right? I've been, like our work has been ripped off a lot, and I always question, like, why, how are they dealing with their conscience, the internal conflict about it? Well, the answer is right here. They don't have it.
Yeah.
They have no internal conflict, right? Values are borrowed, not chosen, right? There's no internal dissonance because behavior is justified by cultural norms, basically. I'm doing this because everybody else is doing this. Right?
Yeah.
Now, again, he uses also the word psychopathic in the broader sense, not in the clinical sense of these being criminals or psychopaths, but really his definition of psychopathic was the lack of internal development, right? And not just antisocial behavior. It's interesting, he mentioned in his book then also other researchers talked about this mechanical existence of people in level 1. They have called, there's this person, Jablonski in 1972 described the term robopath as somebody or people whose pathology entails robot-like behavior and existence, right? They're socially dead, functioning through a pseudo-false image, performing roles rather than living as true individuals. He even described them back then already as people who live a soulless existence, right? An existential vacuum. It's really just people living in a stimulus response society, a society where an individual does not need to reflect or to think, but merely respond, right? I mean, you can see it even nowadays, people becoming more automated consumers, right? And really with lack of any inner life, any inner reflection, or even potential to create as well. So in a sense, the way the society has been set up over the years, that ties into Krishnamurti's quote, it's no measure of health to be well-adjusted to profoundly sick society, because what is happening, there's an emergence of what he called robopathology or normalized psychopathy, exactly that. And this is very important to understand, because since people in level 1 who exist on this level really contain the majority of the world, 65%, so they determine the status quo. The culture, the society is based on pathological values, so to speak, or where pathology has become normalized. And then people try to adjust to that, right? Exactly like Krishnamurti said in his quote.
So it's actually a good sign if you don't fit in. It's a sign of your own soul potential, essentially, in a nutshell, because what's going on in modern society is based on this robo-pathology, which, as we'll talk about in a second, also is explained by what we call the NPC phenomenon. Okay, so the danger of level 1 is because it's socially accepted on a mass level, and it also has the potential to gain a lot of material success. You can gain status in the world. Level 1 does become very seductive because it offers safety, because you belong to the crowd. It gives social validation. You get rewarded externally, for many of us, if your parents were like mine, who basically told you need to basically go to college and make lots of money, and then we're going to see you as successful. You get rewarded by your peers and by your family and by your tribe for doing all of these things. So it kind of seems counterintuitive, because then when you go against the grain, you tend to actually experience more resistance from them. So, at this level, many people do remain their entire lives without ever experiencing discomfort, suffering that initiates these deeper levels of transformation. And Dabrowski estimates that 65% of humanity never go beyond this level 1. And it's not that these people are stupid, bad people. They're not evil. They're just uninitiated, and they're inert by design. And some people, may even appear spiritual or compassionate. I would even argue, sometimes they can seem like really nice people. There's nothing necessarily wrong with them. But their morals, they've adopted from the masses. It's not from an inner sense of conscience. So it's just this kind of virtue signaling, like, okay, we care about Ukraine. We care about these social issues. And I'm going to show you that I'm a compassionate person based on aligning with these things. And, it's not integrated based on their own values. And I actually think this gets to be a little bit more nuanced too, because even in the spiritual, quote unquote, community, you see a lot of people kind of adopt the same language and habits and patterns. I even hear a lot of people talk about shadow work, but aren't actually engaged in it. So it's very fascinating to see that these hive minds are not just you being like a normal person who like goes, watches Netflix and sports or whatever. There's all these individual hive minds, even within so-called like alternative communities as well. So this also maps onto this whole NPC idea, when people just parrot other phrases. And this NPC thing isn't just one side of the political spectrum. I would argue there's like NPC behavior in every single like community or group. There's always these phrases that are just repeatedly parroted by other people without this deeper awareness. It's just based on mimicking, essentially. Or the organic portals. We did a whole episode on NPCs, organic portals, and soulless humans, where they just serve as conduits for the collective unconscious or the herd mind. They act very mechanical, programmed. And Gurdjieff's teachings also point at people being machines aligns with Dabrowski's concept of level 1. So according to Gurdjieff, the ordinary man or woman tends to live life mechanically. They just react to circumstances. They're a product of their programming. And similarly, in Dabrowski's theory, level 1 people believe they're acting out of free will when they're basically acting out of social conditioning, culturally programmed norms, their own biological instincts. And to quote Gurdjieff, quote, "People are machines. Machines have to be blind and unconscious. They cannot be otherwise. And all their actions have to correspond to their nature. Everything happens. No one does anything. Progress, in quotes, and civilization, in quotes, is the real meaning of these words. In the real meaning of these words can appear only as a result of conscious efforts. They cannot appear as a result of unconscious mechanical actions. And what conscious effort can be, they're in machines. If one's machine is unconscious, then 100 machines are unconscious. And so are 1,000 machines, or 100,000, or 1,000,000. And the unconscious activity of 1,000,000 machines must necessarily result in destruction and extermination. It is precisely in unconscious and voluntary manifestations that all evil lies. You do not yet understand and cannot imagine all the results of this evil, but the time will come when you will understand." And so Gurdjieff warned that the unconscious activity of these masses of machine-like humans tends to lead to destruction and extermination. And Dabrowski echoed this in a different terms, where he said a society dominated by level 1 individuals is pathological, stagnant, and incapable of higher values. So when you have this unconscious activity of machines, it it's cultural collapse. It results in mass manipulation. It results in a spiritual decay of society, which is why there probably won't be a collective awakening anytime soon, because machines don't awaken unless they begin to break down and disintegrate first. So level 1 is a state of existential sleep. And interestingly, I wrote an article on my Substack. You can still follow me there on lauramatsu.substack.com, where I talked about how people are becoming more machine-like while AI is becoming more human-like.
Oh, that's true.
And it's very fascinating to witness. And when I say people are becoming more machine-like, I was kind of referring to this, but I also noticed that there's this thing with influencers where they speak in a very monotonous, cold voice. They have a very blank face. They're very emotionless. And it's a symptom of trauma and being checked out. Well, ironically, ChatGPT and other AI models add ums and ahs and laughters and vocal inflections. It's really crazy reversal going on right now. So I would argue that people are even becoming more accelerated like machines, not only because we're so plugged into machines all the time, but because arguably of trauma, making us have more flat emotional range and being more checked out. So what's needed to move from level 1 to level 2? So number 1, the shift from level 1 to level 2 isn't guaranteed. It requires either some sort of shock in your life, a crisis, or just a profound sensitivity that will open you up to disillusionment, or what the esoteric traditions called moral bankruptcy. So we're going to explore that process in depth in the second hour. We're also going to examine levels 2 to 5 in more detail, how to recognize where you are and what is needed to move through each level, and the traps that can lead to either stagnating at a certain level or regressing to a lower level. And we're going to tie this into other esoteric teachings and psychospiritual work. So if you want to become a member and listen to all the second hours of our podcast, you can go to veilofreality.com/membership and you can join, and we hope to see you on the second hour.